The first time my son-in-law ever asked me for anything, it was my blessing. The last time he asked me for anything, it was my truck, and by then I'd already decided the answer before he finished the sentence. That's not a coincidence. That's 61 years of paying attention to how people treat you when they think you can't do anything for them anymore. My name is Harold Pruitt. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years driving long-haul freight before my knees gave out, and I have been the kind of father-in-law who kept his opinions to himself because that's what you do when you love your daughter more than you love being right. I was wrong to stay quiet as long as I did. Took me a while to learn that, but I got there. My daughter Casey married a man named Trent Bellamy 9 years ago. Good-looking, good job selling commercial insurance. The kind of smile that works on everybody except the people who've lived long enough to notice a smile doesn't tell you anything about a man's character. Trent's mother, Diane, moved in with them 4 years back after her second knee replacement made the stairs in her own house impossible. Diane was 79. Sharp as a tack, sweet as they come, the kind of woman who thanked you twice for every small thing you did for her because nobody had ever done enough small things for her before. I liked Diane. Genuinely liked her. We'd sit on Casey's back porch some Sunday afternoons and she'd tell me stories about raising Trent alone after his father left, working 2 jobs at a diner and a dry cleaner's just to keep the lights on. She never asked anybody for anything her whole life. That's what made what happened to her in November feel like such a betrayal, because it happened to a woman who'd spent 8 decades not being a burden to a single soul. It was a Tuesday, the 11th of November, 6:14 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I was already up drinking coffee at my kitchen table on Larchmont Street, 3 miles from Casey's place, when my phone rang and it was Diane's name on the screen, which never happened, because Diane didn't call people before 9 unless something was wrong. Harold. Her voice had a wet, thick sound to it I'd never heard from her. I don't feel right. My face feels funny on one side, and I can't seem to get my words to come out straight. Diane, I said, already standing, already moving toward my boots by the door. Can you move your arm? Both arms? A pause that lasted too long. My left one won't do what I tell it. I hung up, and I was in my truck inside of 90 seconds. My 2016 Ford F-150, the only vehicle I owned since my wife passed 3 years back, and I sold her sedan because looking at it in the driveway every morning was more than I could carry. I called Casey's house phone as I pulled out, because Trent had a habit of not answering his cell before 8. Casey picked up on the 4th ring, groggy. Dad, it's early. Casey, listen to me. Your mother-in-law is having a stroke. Face drooping, arm not working, slurred speech. I need somebody to get her to Riverside Memorial right now, this instant, and I'm 11 minutes out. I heard rustling, heard her sit up. Trent, get up, your mom's sick. Then I heard him. Muffled, but not muffled enough. What? Now? I've got the Kowalczyk account presentation at 9. Casey, this is the biggest renewal of the quarter. Trent, she's having a stroke. Call an ambulance then. I can't just not show up to this. They've been waiting 6 months for this deal. I sat in my truck at a red light on Ashford Boulevard with my knuckles gone white on the wheel, listening to this man weigh his mother's brain against a commercial insurance renewal, and something in my chest went cold and very, very quiet. Casey's voice, sharper now. Trent, she is having a stroke in your house right now. Then you take her. I have to shower. I have to be presentable. This account is the difference between my bonus and no bonus this year, Case, you know that. I'm on my way, I said into the phone, and I don't think either of them heard me, because the line had already gone to shouting on their end, muffled, far away, a woman's voice rising and a man's voice staying maddeningly, coldly level, the level of a man who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up to it. I pulled into that driveway on Chestnut Ridge Court at 6:23 in the morning, and I didn't even put the truck in park all the way before Casey was coming out the front door, half-dressed, dragging Diane by the arm, Diane's face slack on the right side in a way that made my stomach drop straight through the floor of that truck. Dad, Casey said, and her voice cracked wide open. Dad, he wouldn't. He said he had a meeting. Get in, I said. Both of you, now. Trent came to the doorway in his undershirt, phone already up to his ear, already talking to somebody about spreadsheets, and he looked at us, loading his own mother into my truck, like we were mildly inconveniencing his morning schedule, and he called out, "Not unkindly exactly, just distracted. Just a man checking a box. Let me know how it goes. Text me updates when you can." I did not answer him. I put that truck in gear and I drove 11 minutes to Riverside Memorial and 8, and Diane held my hand in the front seat the whole way, her grip weak on the left side, strong as iron on the right, and she kept saying over and over, thin and slurred, "I'm sorry, Harold, I'm so sorry to be trouble." "Diane," I said, keeping my eyes on the road and my voice as steady as I could make it. "You are not trouble. You have never once in your life been trouble. Do you hear me?" She didn't answer that. She just squeezed my hand harder, and Casey in the back seat was crying quiet, furious tears. And I thought, not for the first time, that I had raised my daughter better than to end up loving a man who checked his calendar before he checked on his own mother's face. Welcome to the show. If this is your first time here, drop where you're watching from down in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and stick around, because this story earns every minute of it. Riverside Memorial's emergency bay took Diane back within 4 minutes of us walking in, because the intake nurse took one look at that drooping face and didn't wait for insurance cards or paperwork. A doctor named Anna Reyes, compact, fast-moving, the kind of calm that comes from having seen 1,000 mornings exactly like this one, got Diane into imaging inside of 20 minutes. "Mr. Pruitt," she said to me in the hallway, because somewhere in the chaos I'd become the responsible party, "we're looking at an ischemic stroke, moderate severity. The window for intervention is tight. We caught it early enough that intervention gives her a real shot. If she'd come in even 40 minutes later, we'd be having a very different conversation." 40 minutes. I thought about Trent in his undershirt telling us to text him updates. I thought about a shower and a presentation about spreadsheets. And I had to walk out to the parking lot for a minute and just breathe the cold November air until my hands stopped shaking, because if I'd gone back in that hospital room feeling what I was feeling, I don't know what would have come out of my mouth. Casey found me out there. "Dad, I'm fine," I told her, which wasn't true, but it was close enough to get through the day. "He's not coming, is he?" she said. It wasn't really a question. I didn't answer that either. Some things a daughter needs to arrive at on her own, in her own time, without her father putting his thumb on the scale. Diane came through the procedure at 11:40 that morning. Dr. Reyes met us with the kind of face that wasn't celebrating but wasn't grieving either, careful, measured. We got there in time. There will be some recovery ahead, some rehabilitation for the left side, speech therapy likely, but Mrs. Bellamy is going to be okay. She's a fighter. Casey sat down hard in a plastic waiting room chair like her legs had simply stopped being willing to hold her up, and she put her face in her hands, and I sat down next to her and put my arm around my daughter's shoulders the way I'd done since she was 6 years old and skinned her knee on Larchmont Street, and I didn't say a word, because there wasn't a word invented yet that fit what either of us was feeling. We sat in that waiting room together for 3 hours before they let us back to see her. Vending machine coffee that tasted like scorched cardboard, a television bolted to the corner playing a cooking competition on mute, and my phone in my pocket that did not once, not one single time, buzz with a message from Trent Bellamy, asking if his own mother was alive. At 2:15 in the afternoon, they let us into Diane's room. She was propped up, the right side of her face working again, the left side still slack but improving, an IV taped to the back of her good hand. She looked small in that bed in a way she'd never looked small on Casey's back porch, telling stories about the diner and the dry cleaners, and something about that smallness settled into my chest and stayed there. "Harold," she said, thick but understandable now. "You came." "Diane," I said, pulling a chair up close. "I'll always come." She reached over with her good hand and patted mine, twice, and her eyes went past me, toward the doorway, like she was looking for somebody who wasn't there and had already stopped expecting him to be. "Where's my son?" she asked, and her voice was very quiet. Casey's hand found mine under the blanket at the edge of the bed, and neither one of us answered right away, because how do you tell an 80-year-old woman, fresh out of stroke intervention, that her only child chose a spreadsheet over her collapsing face? "He had a work thing," Casey finally said, and I heard what that sentence cost her. Diane nodded slowly. She didn't cry, didn't raise her voice. She just looked toward the window where the gray November light was coming in flat and even, and something moved across her face that I recognized, because I'd seen that same look settle over my own late wife once, years back. The exact moment a person stops being surprised by someone and starts simply seeing them clearly for the first time. If you've stuck with me this far, do me a favor and hit that like button, drop a comment, and make sure you're subscribed, because I promise you this story is only getting started. I stayed until visiting hours ended at 8 that night. Casey stayed too, in the corner chair, scrolling her phone with a look on her face I didn't like. Watching, I found out later, a group text where Trent had sent 3 separate updates about the Kowalczyk account and one single message, sent at 4 p.m., 8 hours after his mother's stroke, that read, "How's mom doing? Keep me posted. Swamped today." I drove Casey home that night because she didn't trust herself behind a wheel, and we rode in silence past the strip malls and the gas stations of Ashford Boulevard, and finally, 3 blocks from her house, she said, very quiet, "I don't know who I married anymore, Dad." I kept my eyes on the road. Sometimes, sweetheart, people don't change. Sometimes we just finally get a clear enough look at what was always there. She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. Some things you have to sit with a while before you're ready to say them out loud to anybody, even your own father. Wednesday, the 12th of November, 5:50 in the morning. I woke up before my alarm, because something sitting on your chest doesn't care what time you set your clock for. I lay there in my empty house on Larchmont Street, in the bed that used to have my wife on the other side of it, and I thought about Diane's face asking where her son was, and I thought about 40 minutes, and I got up and made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and waited for the sun to come up over the Kaminsky's fence line next door. My phone rang at 7:30. "Casey, Dad," she said, and her voice had a different quality to it than the day before, steadier, harder underneath, like something had set overnight the way concrete sets. "Can you come over? I want you here when I talk to him." I was in my truck in 4 minutes. Trent was at the kitchen table when I walked in, coffee in front of him, tie already on, looking for all the world like a man who'd had a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. He looked up at me with something that wanted to be a smile and didn't quite make it there. "Harold, hey, thanks for handling all that yesterday, man. I really appreciate it. That account was do or die. You know how it is." I did not sit down. I did not shake his hand. I stood in that kitchen doorway, and I looked at him the way I used to look at a load that hadn't been strapped down right, careful, patient, already knowing it was going to shift on the first hard turn. "Trent," I said, "your mother asked where you were. From her hospital bed, after a stroke." His jaw tightened, just slightly. "I know," Case told me. "Look, I feel terrible about the timing, I really do, but I can't just drop everything every single time something happens with her. I've got a career, I've got responsibilities." Casey came in from the hallway then, arms crossed, and her voice was flat and clear in a way I'd never heard from my daughter before, not once in 28 years. "She has never once asked you for anything, Trent. Not when your dad left. Not when she worked 2 jobs to raise you. Not when her knees went out and she moved in here so she wouldn't be a burden. And the one time, the one single time in 4 years, she needed you, actually needed you, you asked if you could shower first." Trent set his coffee cup down harder than he meant to, coffee sloshing over the rim. "That's not fair. Casey, you're acting like I don't care about my mother." "I'm acting like you showed me exactly how much you care about her," Casey said, and her voice didn't rise, didn't crack. It just went very still and very final, the same stillness I'd heard from Diane in that hospital bed the day before, and I finally saw it clearly. Trent looked at me then, like he was hoping I'd step in and smooth things over the way fathers-in-law are supposed to, keep the peace, let it slide. I didn't say a word. I just stood there in that doorway with my arms folded, letting the silence do the talking, because I had run out of patience for smoothing things over about 11 minutes into a truck ride to Riverside Memorial the morning before. "This is insane," Trent said, standing up now, voice climbing for the first time. "My mother is fine. The doctors said she's fine. I don't understand why everybody's acting like I committed a crime because I had one important meeting." "She almost died, Trent," Casey said, quietly, devastatingly quietly. "And you asked for updates like she was a package being delivered." The kitchen went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and, somewhere down Chestnut Ridge Court, a dog barking twice and going quiet. Some people spend a lifetime making withdrawals from love they never once deposited into. Trent Bellamy had been overdrawn for years, and Tuesday morning was just the day the bank finally called it in. "I want to be with my mother when she gets discharged," Casey said. "I want to help her through rehab. I want to be there. And I need to know right now whether you're going to be a partner in that or whether you're going to keep checking your calendar every time she needs somebody." Trent ran a hand down his face, and for just a second, I thought maybe, some small honest piece of him was going to surface. It didn't. Instead, he said, quiet and clipped, "You're being dramatic. She had a stroke, not a heart attack. The doctor said she's a fighter, she's going to bounce back fine, and I've got a career that doesn't pause for every medical scare in this family." "Every medical scare," Casey repeated, very soft, very deadly. "She's your mother, Trent. Not a scare. Your mother." I left them to it after that, because some conversations a father needs to let his daughter finish on her own, without his shadow standing in the doorway, making her braver than she's ready to be alone. I drove back to Riverside Memorial to sit with Diane, who was sharper that morning, the left side of her face coming back to her a little more each hour, working a word puzzle app on the hospital tablet with her good hand and her tongue between her teeth in concentration. "Harold," she said without looking up. 6 letters. Someone who shows up when it matters. I sat down in the chair beside her bed. "I don't know, Diane. What's the answer?" She looked up at me, over the top of the tablet, and there wasn't a trace of confusion left in that face, stroke or no stroke. "Neighbor," she said, "or friend, or father. Turns out there's a lot of right answers to that one, just not the one I was hoping for." I reached over and took her good hand. "Diane, I'm sorry. Don't be sorry for him, Harold." She squeezed my fingers with more strength than I expected. "I raised that boy alone from the time he was 6 years old. 2 jobs, no help, no husband. And I told myself every single day that if I just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, he'd grow up understanding what it costs to show up for people." She looked toward the window. "I don't know where I went wrong. Or maybe I didn't go wrong at all. Maybe some people just choose comfort over love when comfort's an option, and I never gave him the option before, working those 2 jobs. Casey gave him the option, and there it is." I didn't have an answer for that, so I just held her hand and let the quiet sit between us the way quiet does between 2 people who've both been paying attention to the same painful thing. "I've been thinking," she said after a while, "about Paul. Paul Askew, her attorney of 11 years, the man who'd handled her late husband's modest estate back before he'd left, and had drawn up Diane's own will 6 years back when her knees first started going." "Diane," I said carefully, "you don't have to think about anything right now. Just rest. Harold Pruitt, full name, stern as a schoolteacher." And I nearly laughed despite everything, because I hadn't been called by my full name since I was 19 and came home with a motorcycle my mother hadn't approved of. "Don't you tell me what I have to think about. I've had one whole day in this bed to think, and thinking is about the only thing they've let me do." I closed my mouth. "I want to call Paul this afternoon," she said. "I've made some decisions." "Whatever you decide," I told her. "I'll help however you need." "That's why I'm telling you, and not him," she said simply, and there wasn't an ounce of cruelty in it, just fact, plain and warm and settled, the way she'd told me stories about the diner years back. "You've shown up for me more in the last day than my own son has in 4 years of living under the same roof as me." She called Paul Askew at 2 p.m. that afternoon, propped up in that hospital bed, IV taped to her hand, and I sat in the corner chair the way I imagined Trent should have but didn't, quiet, present, a witness to a woman doing the hardest, clearest thing she'd maybe ever done. "Paul," she said when he picked up, "it's Diane Bellamy. I'm at Riverside Memorial. I had a stroke yesterday morning, and I want to change my will." I couldn't hear his side, but I could hear the pause on the line, the professional kind, absorbing rather than stalling. "Today, if you can manage it," she said, "I have some very specific things I want changed, and I'd like my friend Harold here as a witness, if that's permitted." She hung up 20 minutes later, set the tablet aside, and looked at me with a clarity in her eyes that I don't think that stroke had touched at all. "Diane," I said, "you don't have to do this because of me. I'm not doing it because of you, Harold, she said, and there was no anger in it, just the same plain warmth. I'm doing it because I've spent 80 years building a life, alone mostly, and I get to decide who understands what that building cost and who never bothered to ask. If you're enjoying this one, this is exactly the moment to hit subscribe, because what happens next is the reason this story exists. Paul Askew arrived at the hospital at 4:30 that afternoon, gray suit, leather folder, a face that had clearly sat across from 100 deathbed and hospital bed decisions and had learned, the hard way, to keep his own opinions off it. He shook my hand, nodded to Diane with real warmth, and pulled a chair up to her bedside. Their conversation ran 40 minutes. I won't set down every word of it here, because some things are private even in the telling. But I will tell you this. By the time Paul Askew clicked his pen shut and slid that legal pad back into his folder, the document Trent Bellamy had spent 4 years quietly assuming would someday be his, the modest house on Winfield Lane that Diane had bought outright with insurance money after her husband left and paid off 15 years working 2 jobs, the small but steady investment account she'd built one careful deposit at a time, her late mother's wedding ring, and the 1,998 Buick Riviera she still kept running in her garage, because her late husband, whatever his other failures, had restored that engine himself, one summer when Trent was small. All of it had been rewritten cleanly, legally, permanently, and $15,000, earmarked specifically for the literacy program at the Ashford Public Library, because Diane had volunteered there teaching adults to read every Thursday for 9 years, because that was the kind of woman she was, when nobody was checking her calendar for her. Trent's name appeared in that document exactly once, in a single clause acknowledging he had been considered and specifically excluded, so there could be no argument later about oversight. Your friend, Paul said to me quietly at the door, shaking my hand on his way out, is one of the sharpest, clearest-minded people I've worked with in 26 years of practice. Stroke or no stroke. I looked back at Diane, already reaching for her tablet again, already unbothered, already completely herself. I know, I said. I've known that since the first Sunday she told me about the dry cleaners. Thursday, the 13th of November, 7:45 in the morning. I was at Diane's house on Winfield Lane because she'd asked me, specifically, to be the one to bring her home from rehab that day rather than Casey, who was still working through some things of her own 3 miles away on Chestnut Ridge Court. I was standing in Diane's kitchen making her tea, chamomile, steeped 4 minutes exactly because she'd told me once, and I don't forget the things people tell me matter to them, when my phone buzzed on the counter. Casey. Dad, she said, and her voice had that same steady, settled quality from the day before, except firmer now, like concrete 2 full days into curing. I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen. I'm listening. I told Trent last night that I want a separation. She let that sit a moment. I watched him choose a spreadsheet over his mother's face, Dad. And then I watched him choose being right over being sorry, 3 separate times, in our own kitchen. I can't unsee that now. I don't think I'd want to, even if I could. I stood in Diane's kitchen with the kettle ticking as it cooled, and I felt something in my own chest ease loose that had been wound tight since 6:14 Tuesday morning. I'm proud of you, I told her. That's all I've got. I'm proud of you. There's more, she said. Paul Askew called me this morning, too. Diane asked him to. She's putting the house on Winfield Lane in a trust that lets me stay involved in her care and her finances going forward, since apparently, her words, I'm the only Bellamy who ever showed up consistently for anybody in that family besides her. That's between you and her, sweetheart, I said. But I'm glad she trusts you. She should. I heard Casey exhale, long and slow, the sound of a woman setting something down she'd been carrying too long. He doesn't know about any of it yet. The will, the trust, none of it. He still thinks she's just recovering and everything's going to go back to normal once the dust settles. It won't, I said. Some dust doesn't settle back down the way it was. I brought Diane home from rehab that afternoon, 2:30 p.m., her left side stronger every day, her speech clean and unhurried, refusing the wheelchair at the discharge door out of pure stubborn pride until the nurse, a broad-shouldered woman named Louise who'd taken a real shine to Diane over 4 days, made her ride in it as far as the parking lot, hospital policy, no negotiating. I had a stroke, not a personality transplant, Diane announced to the parking lot at large, and Louise laughed the real kind of laugh, not the professional kind, and squeezed Diane's good hand before we drove off. I got her settled into her house on Winfield Lane, tea made, medications lined up and read out loud twice so she'd have them memorized by evening, thermostat checked, refrigerator stocked from a grocery run I'd made that morning before picking her up. She sat at her kitchen table, the same table, she told me, where she'd once done the math on 2 jobs worth of paychecks against 1 mortgage and figured out, somehow, that it would work. Harold, she said, reaching across that table and covering my hand with her good one, the other still healing, still stubborn, still hers. Sit down a minute. I sat. What I did with that will, she said. I didn't do it to punish my son. Her eyes were steady, no bitterness in them at all, just the same plain clarity she'd carried through that entire hospital stay. I did it because I built something out of nothing for 40 years, and it deserves to go to somebody who understands what that costs. You understand that. Casey understands that. He never had to learn it, so he never did. I understand, I told her, and I meant it in my bones. And Harold, she said, her voice dropping just slightly, more deliberate now, not softer. I need you to think about your own life too. Not about my will, not about any of this. About whether you've spent 3 years since your Margaret passed sitting alone in that house on Larchmont Street because it felt like the loyal thing to do, when maybe it's just the lonely thing to do, and those aren't the same, and you've earned the right to figure out the difference. I didn't have an answer ready for that. I looked at her a long moment, this small, sharp, completely unbroken woman sitting at her own kitchen table 3 days after a stroke, still worrying more about my life than her own recovery, and I thought, not for the first time, that I had spent a great many years underestimating exactly how much strength a person could carry quietly, without ever once making a show of it. I know, Diane, I finally said, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to. I hear you. Good, she said, and patted my hand twice, the same way she must have patted her son's face 1,000 times across a childhood he apparently only half remembered the cost of. Now, go find me something decent to eat. Whatever they were serving in that hospital cafeteria tasted like a decision somebody regretted the moment they made it. Friday, the 14th of November, 8:20 in the morning. I was at the hardware store on Ashford Boulevard picking up a new furnace filter, because winter comes for a house on Larchmont Street whether a man's heart is in the mood for maintenance or not, when my phone started buzzing in my jacket pocket. Trent. I let it ring. Not out of strategy, not at first. I simply didn't have a single word in me yet that would land the way it needed to. It rang again, then a third time, a fourth, a fifth, 6 calls inside of 15 minutes, and finally a text. Harold, please call me back. I need to understand what's happening. Casey won't talk to me. Mom won't take my calls. What did I do? Wrong. What did I do wrong? 3 days after his mother nearly died alone in a hospital while he chose a spreadsheet over her collapsing face, and the man genuinely did not know the answer to his own question. I finished paying for my furnace filter, walked out into the cold morning air on Ashford Boulevard, sharp and clean and honest against my face, and I got in my truck and I drove, not to Trent, but to Chestnut Ridge Court, because my daughter had called that morning too, quieter, asking if I'd sit with her while she packed a bag. She was at the kitchen table when I got there, a suitcase open on the floor by the hallway, and Trent's phone, I noticed, sitting face up on the counter buzzing over and over with his own mother's name lighting up the screen unanswered, the way mine had gone unanswered for weeks before that Tuesday morning, though none of us had known to call it a warning at the time. Dad, Casey said, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with finally seeing something she'd spent 9 years choosing not to look at directly. I keep thinking about her face asking where he was, from that hospital bed, and I keep thinking, that's going to be me someday, in some kitchen, asking where he is, and he's going to say he had a meeting. I sat down across from her. You don't have to keep thinking about it, sweetheart. You already answered it. That's why there's a suitcase by the door. She almost smiled at that, the first almost smile I'd seen on her in 4 days. I helped her carry 2 bags out to my truck, and as we were loading the second one, Trent's car pulled into the driveway, and he got out fast, tie loosened, face doing something complicated between confusion and fear. Casey. Case, wait, can we talk, please? Just 5 minutes. Casey stood by my truck, bag still in her hand, and she looked at him for a long moment, really looked, the way I imagined she hadn't let herself look at him in years, careful not to see too much. I asked you a question in that kitchen 2 days ago, she said. I asked if you were going to be a partner when your mother needed you, or if you were going to keep checking your calendar. You never answered me, Trent. You just told me I was being dramatic. I panicked, he said. I said the wrong thing, I know that now. I've had time to think. You've had 3 days to think, Casey said, and her voice was steady, final, the same stillness Diane had carried through that whole hospital room. And in 3 days, you called your mother's phone 11 times to ask her to reconsider a will she rewrote from a hospital bed, and you called me 4 times to ask me to talk her out of it. And you called your mother's phone all 6 of those times before you ever once asked how her recovery was going. That's not panic, Trent. That's just finally showing me clearly what was always there. He stood in that driveway with his hands open at his sides, looking for the first time in the whole 4 days like a man who understood, actually understood, the size of what he'd lost, and it wasn't the house on Winfield Lane or the Buick in the garage. It was his own wife, standing 6 feet away from him with a suitcase, looking at him the way you look at a stranger you used to know. Casey, he said, quieter now. Please. She got in my truck. I closed her door for her, walked around to my side, and before I climbed in, I looked at Trent Bellamy, standing alone in that driveway, phone buzzing again in his pocket, his own mother's name surely lighting up the screen, and I thought about 40 minutes, about the window doctor. Reyes had told me about how close this whole thing had come to a very different ending, and how none of that had ever once slowed him down enough to change what he did next. You should probably answer that, I said, nodding at his pocket, and I got in my truck and pulled out of that driveway and didn't look back. We drove to Diane's house on Winfield Lane, because that's where Casey wanted to go, and Diane met her at the door with her good arm out and her bad arm getting stronger every single day, and she pulled my daughter into a hug that neither one of them seemed inclined to end any time soon. And I stood on that porch for a moment in the cold November air, watching 2 women who'd both been shown exactly who somebody was, finally believing it together. I hadn't been quiet for 11 minutes that Tuesday morning driving to Riverside Memorial. I'd been quiet for years before that, watching a man check his calendar before checking on the people who loved him, telling myself it wasn't my place to say anything, that keeping the peace was the same as keeping things right. It isn't. I know that now. I walked back to my truck, started the engine, and let it idle a minute in the cold, thinking about my Margaret, and about what Diane had said at that kitchen table about the difference between loyal and lonely, and for the first time in 3 years. Sitting alone on Larchmont Street didn't feel like the only decision left available to me. It felt like a door I'd simply never tried the handle on. Some people show up when it costs them nothing. Some people show up when it costs them everything they had planned for that day. Only one of those is love. And it took a stroke on a Tuesday morning to show an entire family exactly which one they'd been living with all along. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and I'll see you on the next one.